So tonight we're going to be continuing our study of Exodus. For those of you who may be visiting with us, we've been working on the book of Exodus on Wednesday nights, and right now we're going through a section that's focused on the law. Last week, JR gave us an introduction to this section, and I'll just quickly recap some of the things he talked about just to get us going and show you what we're going to be talking about today. So what we learned last week was that the Mosaic Law in Exodus chapters 20 through 23 comes in two parts, two main sections. There's the Ten Commandments that we're all pretty familiar with, and then there's also the Book of the Covenant, which comes after that, and that's what Joshua read tonight, was the very beginning of the Book of the Covenant. So the Ten Commandments can be broken up into two sections themselves. There's the first table, which a lot of people call the vertical laws. These are the laws, the first four commandments, and these laws concern the relationship of God with man. And then there's the second table, which is the last six commandments, which has to do with our relationship with each other. The Book of the Covenant is a little bit different. So it has a group of laws that are ordinances that are of the format of you shall or you shall not, and they talk about worshiping God. There's some that talk about how to observe the Sabbath and feasts. And then there's the majority of it is actually case law. So there's a lot of if-then format law. So it's if this happens, if this situation happens, this is what you should do. And those are really more focused, again, on how we treat each other. Well, tonight we're going to be focused on the vertical laws and on the laws and ordinances in the Book of the Covenant that deal with how our relationship is with God, how God wants that relationship to work. So we're going to be covering the first four commandments, and then we're also going to be covering the ordinances that have to do with the worship of God. Now, I don't know how many of you have spent much time studying the Ten Commandments, but it's safe to say that a few people have some opinions on it. There's a little bit of writing out there about them. So there's a lot of material. We're just barely going to scratch the surface on it tonight. And the plan is to walk through these laws and ordinances, and talk about it within the context of what it meant to the Israelites back when it was given to them. And then we're going to circle back through and come back and talk about how and why it's important to us today as Christians. So let's just jump right in. The first commandment in Exodus 20, verse 3 says, "You shall have no other gods before me." Seems pretty simple. But this is probably the most important commandment of all of them. Here, God establishes that he is the singular authority, and this commandment creates the foundation for all other commandments and the law to build upon. Remember, the Israelites at this time, they were coming out of 400 years of being immersed in Egyptian polytheism. Most people back then worshipped multiple gods, and they really didn't see it as a problem. They left that situation. God's delivered them out of it, and now he's leading them to a new home, and there they're going to be exposed, and all the way to there, they're going to be exposed to all the polytheistic pagan worship of the Canaanites. So God foresees this as a problem. It's not just understood to them that there should be no other gods. So if we back up one verse prior to that, we see God laying the foundation for why they should listen to him. In Exodus 20, verse 2, it says, "I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery." Here he invokes the divine name Yahweh, the same name that their ancestor Abraham had taught them about, the name of the God that they knew was the creator, that they'd been taught all the way from generations down from Abraham was the creator, and that he had made a covenant, the same God that made a covenant with Abraham. He's the same God that brought them out of slavery in Egypt. And all the gods that Egypt had that they worshipped were not strong enough to overcome him and prevent his plagues or prevent him from bringing the Israelites out of Egypt. He's establishing here he's the one true God, and he does not want them worshiping any other gods. Now, what about this last part of the verse, the last part of the commandment, before me? Just face value, it almost seems like it's saying maybe it's okay to have other gods as long as you don't place them above God. But that's not what it says. That's not what it means at all. The literal translation for this is before my face, or in other words, in my presence. So you shall have no other gods in my presence. So it's not indicating a sequence of gods or a priority of gods. It's indicating a location. There to have no other gods in his presence. And in case that's still not clear, later on in the book of the covenant in Exodus 22:20, he makes it pretty clear there. It says, whoever sacrifices to any god other than the Lord alone shall be devoted to destruction. Destruction is going to come to anybody who sacrifices anything to any other god. So the second commandment, we'll move on to that. This one's a bit longer, not as simple as the first one, but every bit as important. So we'll break this one into pieces and talk about a section at a time. So starts off as, you shall not make for yourself a carved image. And then we skip down a little bit, it says, you shall not bow down to them nor serve them. So it's talking about carved images and making idols of similar fashion to what we see here. This is a picture of some idols for the ancient Egyptian gods. And God forbids them to do this. In that day, the way that these people knew how to be religious, how to worship, was to make gods or make idols to represent their gods. But in effect, this is making an image of a god is reducing that god to an object of human work and bring it down to a size that a person can manipulate and control and use for their own favor. It was a way for people to attempt to have some control or power over the gods that they claim to worship. But man's attempts to control gods inevitably just results in them actually serving these inanimate objects. Moses warned of this later in Deuteronomy 4:28. He says, and there you will serve gods of wood and stone, the work of human hands, that neither see nor hear nor eat nor smell. He didn't want them to become servants to these inanimate objects that can't see them, can't talk to them, can't hear them. He had just freed them from slavery, and he didn't want them to just willingly put themselves right back into it. Then he goes on to talk about the subjects of idols. He says, any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. So when we're thinking of the second commandment of not making idols, it kind of seems redundant to the first commandment of not having any other gods. But we got to pay attention to what he's talking about here. He's telling them not to make idols of anything in heaven, anything on the earth, or anything beneath or in the sea. He's not just forbidding idols of gods, lowercase g. He's forbidding idols of God with a capital G. He doesn't want them using idols to worship false gods, and he doesn't want them using idols to worship him either. We know they get in trouble for this a little bit later on in Exodus, in chapter 32. It says, and he received the gold from their hand and fashioned it with a graving tool and made a golden calf. And they said, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. When Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it, and Aaron made a proclamation and said, tomorrow shall be a feast to the Lord. So whether this golden calf was intended to be some god that they wanted to worship, or whether it was meant to be the God, as Aaron seems to proclaim here, in either case, they were still breaking this second commandment. They made an idol to a god or God, and this goes completely against what he established in the second commandment. And then he goes on to say, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. God will not tolerate the honor and reverence that is due to him be passed on to somebody else or given to another, not another god or an idol of some god, or even an idol representing himself. Deuteronomy 4:23 and 24 says, take care lest you forget the covenant of the Lord your God, which he made for you, which he made with you, and make a carved image, the form of anything that the Lord your God has forbidden you. For the Lord your God is a consuming fire, a jealous God. Moses reminded the people again in Deuteronomy that making idols is a grave violation of God's covenant. There's only one God who delivered them from the Egyptians, and it was not an idol. Then this last part of the second commandment, we read, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children of the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing mercy to thousands, to those who love me and keep my commandments. Now this doesn't really seem very fair, being punished for the sins of your parents, or grandparents, or great-grandparents. But if we think about this, hasn't this always been the case since the very beginning? Since the fall of man? In Genesis 3, chapter 24, right after Adam and Eve sinned, it says he drove out the man, and at the east of the Garden of Eden, he placed the cherubim and a flaming sword that turned every way to guard the way of the tree of life. So since the beginning, we've been punished for the sins of our ancestors, and we're still seeing that punishment today. But Ezekiel 18:20 tells us something a little bit different, clarifies on this a little bit. It says, the soul who sins shall die. The son shall not suffer for the iniquity of the father, nor the father suffer for the iniquity of the son. The righteousness of the righteous shall be upon himself, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon himself. God will not punish us to the level of death for the sins of another, is what this is saying. And now going back to the second commandment, when he's talking about visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children, remember this is focused within the context of making idols and worshiping idols. And then there's another key word there when he talks about mercy to thousands. So he's really talking about Israel as a whole. This is talking about nationwide idol worship will be punished nationwide. And as we go on throughout the Old Testament, you'll see that going forward, that over and over again, they fall away from God, they start worshiping idols, and then what happens? God allows somebody to come and conquer them and take them off into captivity, and then that lasts for generations and generations until they finally come back to God, and he rescues them again. So that is really what he's talking about here when he's talking about punishing people for the sins of their fathers and grandfathers. So let's move on to the third commandment. In Exodus 20, verse 7, it says, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. This commandment prohibits the use of the Lord's name for any idle, frivolous, or insincere purpose. The word that's translated vain here, it means worthless, deceitful, empty, or false. And there's at least three ways that this is commonly disobeyed. One would be profanity, using the name of God as in blasphemy and cursing. And within the context of the Israelites, that concept would have been foreign to them. That really probably wouldn't have been an issue for them. But there's also frivolity, so using the name of God in a superficial or silly way. And then there's hypocrisy. This probably be the more serious and probably more common back then and probably even more pretty common now, claiming the name of God but acting in a way that disgraces him. So to the Israelites, the name or a name represented the nature and character of a person. Yahweh, this personal name that God had revealed to them, it revealed his character and his nature. So when someone uses it in vain, they're proclaiming that God's being, his nature, and his essence is essentially worthless. Psalms 8:1 tells us, O Lord our God, or O Lord our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You have set your glory above the heavens. And then Psalm 111, verse 9 says, he sent redemption to his people. He has commanded his covenant forever. Holy and awesome is his name. The name of the Lord is to be treated with reverence and respect, because it is the name of the holy God. It represents his character, his attributes, his grace, and his mercy. So let's move on to the fourth commandment. This one's a little longer too, so we'll break this up into pieces as well. It says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work. So God commands the people to remember the Sabbath. But remember, he'd already established the Sabbath back in creation in Genesis 2. It says, thus the heavens and the earth were finished and all the host of them. And on the seventh day God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation. So he'd already established this day as a holy day, but now in the fourth commandment he's putting it in writing. He's formalizing it as a commandment to his people. Unlike the Egyptian rulers that they had just come from, that had ruled over them, God didn't want his people to work around the clock every single day. He wanted them to set aside one day a week to not work and to refocus their minds on holiness. The next section tells us who is to observe the Sabbath. It says, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male, nor your servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates. The rest was for all of Israel. All the servants, all the slaves, men, women, even visitors who were within their community. He didn't specifically mention the wife, but it's implied that when he says you, that the wife and the husband are one together. And this is a pretty important principle. God here is declaring the essential humanity and dignity of women and slaves and strangers, people outside of the Israelites, so Gentiles as well, and said that they have the same right of a day of rest as every Israeli man. This was a pretty radical concept in this time. And then he goes on to explain why. It says, for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. So the Sabbath served multiple purposes, but first and foremost, it was a weekly reminder that the God of the Israelites is the God of creation. He's the one true God. By observing the Sabbath, the Israelites were declaring that they worship the God of creation, and it made them stand out from all other nations. So that's the first four commandments, the vertical laws. Now we're going to move on to the laws for worship that are in the book of the covenant. And Joshua, so that's the part that Joshua read earlier. And this is just the very beginning of the book of the covenant. And so we'll start there. It says, you shall not make anything to be with me. Gods of silver or gods of gold you shall not make for yourselves. So the first law of worship we see here is that idols are forbidden. We already knew that from the second commandment, but just in case it wasn't clear, that is not part of worship. It clearly specifies, don't make idols, not even that represent me, or of God. I'm not God, but you know what I mean. So if we back up one verse, just prior to this law that he gives, we'll just read the context that led into that. It says, then the Lord said to Moses, thus you shall say to the children of Israel, you have seen that I have talked with you from heaven. As I was studying this really stood out to me, and it seemed a little peculiar in a good way that it's hard to get my head around. He says, you have seen that I have talked. Usually if you're thinking about talking, you would think he would have said something, you have heard that I have talked, or you have heard what I said. But no, he says, you have seen that I have talked. So let's back up a few more verses to see what specific event he's talking about where he talked with them. What did the Israelites see? So we go back to verse 18 in the same chapter. It says, now all the people witnessed the thunderings, the lightning flashes, the sound of the trumpet, and the mountain smoking. And when the people saw it, they trembled and stood far off. Then they said to Moses, you speak with us, and we will hear. But let not God speak with us, lest we die. So that's what he means. They had seen the effects of God talking, and it was too much for them. They couldn't handle it. It was so intense, they were afraid they were going to die. Now, actually seeing just even, not even God, but just almost the essence of God, the sound of God, how could they possibly make any idol to represent God in a way that's even close to accurate, that just doesn't look, I don't know, silly? I mean, we know what they ended up doing. They ended up making a calf. How does a calf compare to thundering, lightning, trumpet sound, mountains shaking and smoking? But that's what they came up with. So God does not want that. He does not want that. It's for all kinds of reasons, but he clearly forbids it. And then he goes on and requires an altar for sacrifice. It says, "An altar of earth you shall make for me, and you shall sacrifice on it your burnt offerings and your peace offerings and your sheep and your oxen." So God's method for them to worship him was part of that. A central piece of that was for them to have an altar and to make sacrifices on it, make animal sacrifices of it, of sheep and oxen. And they would do burnt offerings and peace offerings of these animals. And it was only through this offering that they could have that God provided them a provision for atonement that would allow these sinners to have a relationship with God, to enter into his presence in an acceptable manner. Next, he describes what that altar should be. It should be an altar of earth. And it says, "And if you make for me an altar of stone." So earth, dirt, or stone is what that altar should be made of. It was simple materials, could be found anywhere that the Israelites happened to be. They could have the materials available, readily available, to have an altar and worship their God. And then he specifies the locations. He says that he's going to specify locations. It says, "In every place where I record my name, I will come to you and I will bless you." So he will tell them where to build an altar, and they will build it, and wherever that is, he will be there. He will bless them. He will allow them to worship him wherever that is. This is pretty different for them. The pagan gods of this time were pretty much, they had boundaries. They could only go certain places. And God had no geographical restrictions on him. He would go wherever his people happened to be on the earth. He would be there, and they could worship him, and he would bless them in return. And I put there some examples there in the Old Testament of different times where we see that they build these other altars to God and worship him, and he blesses them where they are. Then he specifies, "You shall not build it of hewn stone, for if you use your tool on it, you have profaned it." So if they make the altar with stone, they're not to put any tools on it. They're not to carve it in any way or break it in any way. It's just supposed to be a whole stone as it is, as they found it, as God created that stone. If man were to put some effort into shaping that stone, then you start leading down the path towards where then it becomes something that they start trying to make it beautiful, and they start making it almost like an idol and something that could be worshipped, or something that some man could take pride in and look at this great altar I've built here. And then you start leading down to worshiping the person rather than the creator. Then it says, "Nor shall you go up by steps to my altar." So this altar, wherever they built these altars, they couldn't be high. They couldn't be high in a way that required steps to go up and walk up to them and use them. Back then, in their time, there were altars with elaborate craftsmanship and elevated platforms and staircases, and it was pretty common for different pagan worship. And the thinking was, the higher the altar, the closer you are to the gods that you're worshiping. And God didn't like that. And we see references all through the Old Testament about high places and God not liking them, telling kings to go destroy these high places. In 1 Kings 22:43, it says, "Yet the high places were not taken away, and the people still sacrificed and made offerings on the high places." These aren't altars for God. These are pagan sites of worship, pagan altars. When we see this word high places. So this is another way, by not having high places, by having low on the ground altars, that the Israelites would set themselves apart from the rest of the world. The way the rest of the world worshiped their gods, the Israelites did it completely the opposite. And then lastly, it says that your nakedness may not be exposed on it. So the person doing the offering must be covered. Their skin shouldn't be showing. There shouldn't be a distraction to those worshiping. Again, going back to what was done in this day, what was common in pagan worship was for the people that were up on these elevated platforms doing different things that was part of their worship, was to not have very many clothes on at all, if any at all. It was pretty common. I won't go into any more details than that, but it was completely what God did not want for the people who were worshiping him. He wanted them to be covered. He did not want even the possibility that the worship would then start being focused on the worship of man rather than the worship of God. So, we've covered the first four commandments and the beginning of the book of the covenant, and the question now is what do we need to know about this today? How is the law important to us as Christians today? We're under a new covenant, so does this apply? Is it important? Well, going back to Matthew 5:17, it says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." So Jesus said he didn't come to get rid of the law, he came to fulfill it. So the New Testament has a lot to say about the law, and we're going to go back through these commandments and see what it does have to say about them. So going back to the first commandment, you shall have no other gods before me. 1 Corinthians 8:6, one God. 1 Timothy 2:5, one God. Matthew 6:24, no one can serve two masters. You cannot serve God and money. So it's pretty clear you shall have no other gods before me, that's still in effect. That's still part of the new covenant we have that God's given us. He only wants us worshiping one God. That we have one God, he's the creator, and he is the one that we'll worship. There are no others that we should worship. Now, we're not going to be, most likely, we're not going to face the temptations to worship pagan gods like the Israelites were up against in their time, but we have to be careful not to let the modern things that are in our lives become gods as well. Money, career, hobbies, these are the types of things that we can let infiltrate our life and become a god that we worship and that we put all of our time and effort into. So the second commandment, you shall not make for yourself a carved image. 1 John 5:21 says, little children, keep yourselves from idols. Romans 1, claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. And Acts 17:29 says, being then God's offspring, we ought not to think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of man. And then Colossians 3:5, it says, put to death therefore what is earthly in your sexual immorality. What is earthly in you, sexual immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and covetousness, which is idolatry. So God, he still wants us to stay away from idolatry. It can take a lot of forms, but today what we're most likely to see is covetousness, which is a form of idolatry, and that's probably the one that we would struggle with the most today. Taking the Lord's name in vain. Matthew 6:9 says, this is Jesus speaking. He tells his disciples, pray then like this, our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. God's name is still hallowed. It's still important. It deserves respect. Matthew 7, it says, "On that day many will say to me, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and cast out demons in your name, and do many mighty works in your name?' And then I will declare to them, 'I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness.'" And then again in Matthew 15, it says, "You hypocrites, well did Isaiah prophesy of you when he said, 'This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men.'" So Jesus taught that God's name is sacred, it's hallowed, and he warned against associating God's name with works or teachings that aren't truly focused and centered on God. God knows our hearts, and he knows whether we're honoring him with our words or if we're really just honoring ourselves. And now what about the Sabbath? We don't observe the Sabbath today, do we? That's not something that we do anymore. Well, let's read Mark 2:27 and 28. "And he said to them, 'The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath.'" So Jesus is saying here that he is the Lord of the Sabbath. He's in charge of it. And then Colossians 2:16 and 17 says, "Therefore let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food and drink, or with regards to a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath. These are a shadow of the things to come, but the substance belongs to Christ." So this passage confirms that New Covenant believers aren't required to adhere to the Sabbath laws the way they were, the Israelites were meant to adhere to them in the Old Testament. But he does say that they are a shadow of things to come. So the Sabbath is a shadow of something later, which is now. So it's what is there now. It's going to look a little bit different. In Hebrews 4:9 and 10, it says, "So then there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For whoever's entered God's rest has also rested from his works as God did from his." So this passage tells us that Jesus fulfilled the Sabbath law completely. And Christians now find their rest in Jesus Christ, that he is our Sabbath. So perhaps more than all of the other laws, the Sabbath law falls into that category of fulfilled rather than abolished. So it still exists. It's fulfilled in Jesus. But what we know of as the Sabbath in the Old Testament is just a shadow of what it looks like today with Jesus. So what about these laws specifically about worship, the altar for sacrifice, and all the rules about that? What does this have to do? What do we need to know about this, and how does this relate to the New Testament? Well, let's go to John chapter 4, verse 23 and 24 to think about this, to start thinking about this. It says, "But the hour," this is Jesus speaking to the Samaritan woman at the well, and he tells her, and they're speaking about worship. And he says, "But the hour is coming and is now here when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such people to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth." So explaining that God wants his people to worship in spirit and truth, it still seems kind of vague and not exactly sure what that means. But it'll make a little more sense if we compare it to what these Old Testament laws for worship were. So we think about the Old Testament as we saw on the previous slide, that they are a shadow of the things to come. So the Old Testament worship, these rules about the altars, that they're a shadow of something else in the New Testament. Well, that something else in the New Testament is the truth. That's the reality of what is predicted earlier as the shadow from the Old Testament. And we know that those Old Testament worship was physical in nature. It was fleshly in nature. They were offering animals to God. But the reality, the truth in the New Testament is that the worship is spiritual in nature as opposed to fleshly. So to much better explain this better than I just did, let's go to Hebrews 13, verse 10. It says, "We have an altar from which those who serve the tent have no right to eat." And he's speaking of Jesus. Jesus is the altar. And then skip down to verse 15. It says, "Through him then let us continually offer up a sacrifice of praise to God. That is the fruit of lips that acknowledge his name. Do not neglect to do good and to share what you have, for such sacrifices are pleasing to God. So this is an illustration of what I was talking about before. The Old Testament physical worship it was a shadow of the true worship in spirit of the New Testament. So Jesus is our true altar. He's the real altar, and where we're to offer up sacrifices of praise to God. And those sacrifices, rather than being animals that are sacrificed and their blood is shed on an altar, those sacrifices have been replaced with acknowledging with our lips that who God is, acknowledging his name, doing good, sharing with others. And that is worshiping in spirit and truth. Now, we could use the same analogy and walk through all these other different rules for worship from the Old Testament and see how they relate to the New Testament, but as I predicted, we're out of time, and this just seems like a good place to end this lesson, this point of what worship is in the New Testament. So acknowledge his name, do good, and share. That's the things that please God in our worship today. This concludes our lesson for tonight. If there's anybody here who would like to come up